18th and 19th century colonialism, although it is often viewed from a perspective of Western success, absolutely terrorized Native populations. Affected groups, including Native Americans, Maori peoples from New Zealand, and Africans, are continually burdened with the stress of imperial power structures today. And this is because Western academia, media outlets, and language continue to perpetuate a, quote, single-story narrative, as higher-level researcher Amy E. Harth puts it. Ultimately, at the heart of this issue lies the Western zeal for capital. Deborah Paredes, a scholar of the Duke University Press, demonstrates this fact with the posthumous life of Selena Quintanilla Perez, something she calls, quote, Selenidad. Paredes asserts that Selena's death undermined the authenticity of Latin American identity in the United States, as it segued a trend of harmful cultural commercialization. Pictured here are some images from the Selena collection of the Smithsonian Museum, as well as an advertisement for the Selena Barbie doll. As we can see, the death of this infamous Tejano pop star brought rise to a Western, money-hungry clan of, quote, Selena-holics, as the Latin Times puts it. Seeing just how intensely the Latin identity was capitalized on brought me to my research question. To what extent has 18th and 19th century colonialism framed the way Western civilians perceive the culture of the colonized? In my research process, I considered 3 separate entities: academia, media, and language, as these are things that continue to influence the way Western civilians perceive the outside world. For starters, there exists a conflict of interest in American classrooms. That is, according to Michael Kent Ward, a professor at California State University, educators have the responsibility of satisfying children's, quote, hunger to know about Native American populations. At the same time, though, they have the responsibility of being conscious of the line that exists between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. This is an important point to make here because oftentimes indigenous culture will be subject to oversimplification and inaccurate instruction. For example, in his master's thesis, Andrew C. Holcomb analyzes 6 history textbooks used in Washington's Whatcom County. In one of them, as pictured here, he points out the use of a child's doll to semiotically represent the entire Sioux population in America. Holcomb finds this to be a distinct way in which indigenous life is belittled in academia. As he notes, visually, the doll is a cast aside left on the battlefield, or perhaps a trophy for the victors. She is the spoils of war taken by the soldiers. In a similar way, Western media has, for decades, belittled the African population to an image of regression. In the 19th century, esteemed journalist Rudyard Kipling was published in the London Times and the States' McClure's Magazine for his poem, The White Man's Burden. Despite its evident partiality, as he uses language like, quote, half-devil to describe colonized peoples, Kipling's poem reached the forefront of Western media in the 1800s. Now, in today's world, media biases are much more subtle, but they are equally as detrimental. For one, according to researcher Amy E. Harth, Western media outlets spotlight, quote, crisis news stories in a way that decontextualizes circumstances in Africa. At the same time, these outlets act as global, quote, watchdogs, making the inherent presumption that all international discord is sourced outside of the West. Finally, the burden of misrepresentation lies in Western language. In a literal sense, according to Margaret Mutu, a professor at the University of Auckland, there were key differences in the Treaty of Waitangi and Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which is the Maori translation of this text. The Maori version of this document appeared to New Zealand's natives as, quote, a confirmation of rights previously guaranteed in the Maori Declaration of Independence. However, these same beliefs were not reciprocated on the British side of things. So, this is why Maori believes that the, quote, Humpty Dumpty principle was implemented in the formulation of these documents. Essentially, this means that the British colonizers may have intentionally tweaked their understanding of Maori words in an effort to restrict the legislative power of these people. Similarly, in Western language today, particularly in Western written history, Maori culture is placed in a box. According to historian Judith Binney, the Western narrative of development is very linear and therefore suppresses the cyclical, multifaceted, and oral history carried by Maori populations. This leads me to my solution, which is de-Westernization, particularly in the fields of academic knowledge production and media production. De-Westernization is really the intentional dilution of Western ideology, and in this case, in academic spaces and in media productions. This means that those in charge of knowledge production in Western nations should begin to broaden the scope of their research in an effort to legitimize non-Western narratives. And according to researcher Ans-Chi Gluck, authors, publishers, and educators should begin, quote, striving for a more cross-cultural inclusiveness in their publications. Of course, though, de-Westernization is not a foolproof solution to erasing the effects of colonialism. In fact, it fails to mitigate the economic imbalances that currently exist between formerly colonized nations and former colonial superpowers. This is why many experts rely on reparations as a more efficient and effective solution. Now, while reparations do provide some sense of financial security to descendants of colonized peoples, they do not target the issue of cultural hegemony, which is particularly targeted by de-Westernization. And finally, here are my reference slides.
Thank you. What information did you need that you were not able to find or locate?
So during my research process, I was really hoping to find a primary source document from the 18th and 19th century, particularly a primary source newspaper article that would help to strengthen my argument about biases in media that have continued from the 18th, 19th century until now. Even though I was able to find a primary source poem, The White Man's Burden, from Rudyard Kipling, I was not able to find a specific news article that demonstrated that same idea.
And how did you use the conclusions or questions of others to advance your own research?
So at the beginning of my research process, I discussed with a peer what we would be doing for our project. She told me that she would be researching how history repeats itself. Now, I found this really intriguing, and for this reason, I decided to make connections in my presentation and in my individual written argument from the 18th and 19th century and now in the 21st century. As you see, I made very distinct connections between these two time periods. So the conclusions that my peer came up with really influenced my actions of talking about the enduring solutions rather than just the historical effects of 18th and 19th century colonialism.
Thank you.